Welcome to my show. I'm Elizabeth Liz Muschett, and today we're talking about Neptune moves into Aries in 2025. And my colleague and friend and fellow astrologer, Robert Pacitti, is joining me today. So, welcome, Robert. How are you doing
Hi,
today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. This is a fascinating topic, and I've been doing a lot of research for a long time on Neptune. I come from a nature spirituality background, and to me, Neptune ultimately represents our enchantment with the world. It's that kind of magical force where inspiration meets life force. And that brings us into a place of enchantment. And I think that Neptune really represents that in so many ways, in our charts and also in the mundane world astrology.
Well, thank you for joining me today, and we're going to get started here. So, Robert's website is deepearthastrology.com, and my website is alightpath.com, and we enjoy hearing from you. And we're talking about Neptune today. So, I put up a picture of Neptune. And go ahead and start, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, Neptune is one of the outer planets. I mean, it takes roughly 164 years for it to complete the zodiac cycle, and it spends about 13 to 14 years in each sign. Coming up for a definition for Neptune is challenging because Neptune really doesn't have a definition. That's what it does. That's how it operates. You know. So one of the ways that I tend to look, a good starting place to look at Neptune is the description that it is a higher octave of Venus. Venus is kind of our corporeal values, what we're attracted to, how we love, the things that we like to possess, and our art, our music, our style is all Venus. And that all happens really on a personal level. But Neptune takes that up to the transcendent heavens. It's really the fuel that feeds that Venus, that makes us connect to the collective unconscious or the collective conscious, whichever one. It's the dream world. It's infinite and it's immaterial. And when you look at Neptune as a planet, I mean, I tend to, again, my milieu is nature spirituality, and we look at these outer planets, and we didn't know much about them. They weren't observable in the sky. I mean, sometimes Uranus is slightly. Um, but Uranus is definitely like the disruptor, and it's unique, it's rebellious, it's different, and we see it's turned on its side, and it's got a ring, and it's just this weird thing out there, and and then we look at Pluto. Um, Pluto, we didn't really have a good idea of what it looked like for a very long time. It's an ice world. It's small. It's unique. But what did Pluto do? It got its name taken from it. It's no longer a planet. It was reborn as a trans Neptunian body. That process of rebirth we see there. So we're seeing the physical and the spiritual worlds kind of merge in there within our archetypal understanding of these outer planets. And with Neptune, it's this beautiful bluish hue with winds of 1,200 miles an hour, this stormy, everything is this amalgamation of everything all at once. And I feel that represents Neptune in so many ways. It's transcendent. It governs spirituality. It's symbolic. It's pre-verbal. It's imaginative, enchanted, non-corporeal, and it can certainly feed into our religious philosophies, how we feel about spirit. And we see it really in three different forms, within astrology, at least the astrology that I practice. And that is within the natal, the transit, and the mundane or the world astrology. We don't really look too much at these outer planets in the progress chart because they're moving so slowly. There's not going to be really, other than some aspects that might occur with the personal planets, you're not really going to see too much movement within the outer planets on a progress chart. And in our natal chart, it represents like where we refuse to be limited by things, where we find spirituality, uh, where we can become unattached from things and become diffusive, where we're unrealistic. That's the truth of Neptune. All of these archetypes have these multivalent kind of abilities. They're not negative. They're not positive. There's a multivalent, effervescent world where we can all pull these archetypal qualities from. And Neptune is really the one that is the most diffuse, in my opinion. Um, Now, this can bring positive or negative. Again, good example. My my Neptune is conjunct my moon in my second house. I have this very nebulous arrangement with money in my life. I've I've been I've had very high paying jobs. I've had a lot of wealth. I've been very poor and when I was doing artistic jobs, but it never really kind of held me up. It was never a thing that I was too concerned about. Money is just this nebulous thing in my life. And where we have Neptune, especially in the house, is where we see that quality of it's sometimes this, it's sometimes that, you know, um, we tend to put lot of spirit into it, a little bit of magic. It's not something that's very concrete. Um, and it can certainly be very creative. I mean, we were talking earlier, and you were talking about your Neptune in the fifth house in Scorpio, and I mean, psychic abilities, the alchemy, but there's a joy in the fifth house too. These are things that that creativity and that ability to connect into the alchemy of the universe is probably something that brings you a lot of joy. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree.
Y-
Totally.
Yeah. So I mean, now that can come with some negatives. There's certainly a lot of texts out there that would say that poorly placed or aspected Neptunes can cause addiction, mental health problems, in the eighth house we see that often represented there. That's a pretty common trope. In the 12th house, when we see Neptune, it could be our inability to kind of identify our enemies, or a very diffuse connection to the collective unconscious. In the ninth house, though, it can be somebody who's very spiritually proactive and very spiritually minded and can be like a guru figure. In the 11th house, it's somebody whose spirit goes to the entire community. So there's multiple ways where it can express itself. um, and in transit it's a little bit different than the natal chart. I feel like when I see a Neptune transit, it's a time of disillusion. You're dissipating. It's kind of the pre-Pluto in a lot of ways. um, Confusion, delusion is another one. Confusion and delusion, they're two very different things, but they operate on the about the same level. We can lie to ourselves, and that is very Neptunian at times in our lives. But it's also like it can be a very spiritual time. It's when we find spirit and magic in the world. Prophecy. I know somebody that was having a Neptune conjunct Mercury period in their life, and they were having this nagging feeling that something was going to happen. And I was like, I would trust your instincts on this one. I mean, you're right now, you are connected to the diffuse collective unconscious. I would never tell somebody to not listen to spirit when there is a conjunction between your Neptune and your Mercury. So those are also creativity. I mean, let's be honest, when you're able to access the all of that, information, the nebulous, the spirit, before things are really turned into a corporeal form, you're just working with more ingredients to get to that creative point. And I feel like Neptune really does that. For especially when we're talking about the softer aspects, trines and sextiles. um, Now I feel like the outer planets, in the mundane or world astrology, are where we really see the greatest effects, because they are outer planets. I'm a big subscriber to Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, and he talks a lot about a concept called waveforms. And waveforms are essentially a period of time where a planet's influence ramps up, peaks, and then goes back down. If I'm looking at a natal chart for a Neptune conjunction, it's a small orb. Um, I'm certainly not going out to anything past 5, in my opinion. Some astrologers are different. Everybody has their own way. Um, when we're looking at it from a world astrology standpoint and sometimes a transit standpoint, I feel like these orbs open up and their sphere of influence really works together with each other, especially Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and that they have these periods where they ramp up and then slow down. And as we said in the beginning, Neptune has a 14-year period where it spends time in a sign. So that whole 14-year-old period, it's going to be that long period of ramping up, hitting its peak, and then fading back down. And I do feel like there is a little bit of crossover, especially when we're talking about the shadow periods of the retrogrades, where those two signs are kind of fighting for dominance a little bit during those. Um, and overall in the mundane world, it's that collective dream world. It influences music and art, memes. I mean, let's not forget memes. We forget memes in the in the vernacular because so many of the books that we learn from, memes weren't even a thing. But as far as like the modern, milieu of where we're at on a social standpoint, memes are very Neptunian. They're often sending a hidden message. It's a symbol. It's cryptic. It's non-focused, but you get the vibe. And we see those. Memes are a very powerful conveyor of the Neptunian archetype and the Neptunian spirit in our current society. Uh, it's overall, in my opinion, the unconscious vibe that we all feel, but we can't quite describe. We're all feeling it. It could be a million different things. It could be nothing, but we all have this sense of connecting to it. Pre-verbal. It's pre-verbal, and what that is really how I kind of view the overall Neptune.
Well, and
And
I
going
would
back,
say that when we're it can bring fog or hide things, and then it illuminates. And when the fog parts, it's like the light being turned on, and it's like, oh, I didn't understand that. And when you get that understanding, then you can work on it to change it and fix it.
yes, yes, and I think the thing about Neptune in particular is that there's room for every voice. um, Neptune does not separate very well. It's all about that kind of milieu. And um, one of my teachers, uh, Santino, he pretty much created vibrational astrology. He feels like Neptune is all about that magical connection to the spiritual world, but it's modern rulership is in Pisces, and Pisces in that context is all about taking disparate parts and merging them together into something else. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. you know, and I feel like that's really hitting on exactly what you're talking about. It's there's no clear target with Neptune. Usually, and then again that fog parts, and then we're like, oh, that's what that was. That whole period of time was trying to convey. Um, I think that when we go now, this podcast is about the Aries ingress of Neptune, and we're talking really about the zero Aries point. And for those of you who are not, studying astrology intently, that might not make a lot of sense. But Aries is the beginning of the natural zodiac. It's the reset point of the cycle, and the zero Aries point represents that. um, so it is this reset of how we're going to be engaging with that preverbal unconscious world, and really we have so much there that is going to shape that. And I think it's important to, as we get into the Aries, to understand that each one of these zodiac signs is a response to the other. They're not just random archetypes put into 12. Um, we to, we can understand how the mundane and the world astrology is going to be affected by looking at the progression of Neptune up to this point, and then going back and looking to how those other Aries ingresses affected us in the past. So from 1970 to 1984, Neptune was in Sagittarius. I find Sagittarius to be a very wild primal sign. It's the only sign that is both man and beast. It's where we're able to kind of take that primal instinct and put the human intellect on top of it. Um, Listen, 1970 to 1984, it was a wild time. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There was a lot of uh, talk about philosophy, and different ways of doing things. Breaking, Sagittarius loves truth, but unlike Scorpio, who is known for that ultimate truth, Sagittarius likes the freedom of truth. It wants options. Um, and I feel like we were really living in that time. I mean, think of the music of the era, the disco, very, very like, all right, let's all get in the club and we're going to dance. And, there was a lot of free sex going on at that point, in the 70s and the early 80s. And then we got to 1984. It moved to Capricorn, 1984 to 1998. What was Capricorn all about? Well, that was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. All of that freewheeling time that we had, while it was in Sagittarius, there was a lot of that Saturnian restriction of Capricorn got put onto things, and we moved towards wealth as the kind of driving subconscious factor. I mean, think of like Glengarry Glen Ross. Everything for accumulation of money and wealth. Greed is good. That was a big sign in that period of time from the movie Wall Street. This was a time when a lot of people were gaining wealth. This is when those McMansion houses started popping up. Went from like a very realistic living situation to we need everything as big and wealthy as possible. Um, we supersized everything. We wanted more value. We wanted more of these Capricornian qualities. And again, it was really built on that format of Capricornian discipline, that Saturnian discipline that had to be an answer to what was going on in the 70s. I mean, there was a lot of crime in that period as well in the 70s. There was a lot of response to that crime in the 80s when things came in. And we're talking more about the US right now. But I mean, at this point in time, US culture and a lot of US things were pretty the premium, getting spread throughout the rest of the world. So it's not surprising to me. Then we got to 1998, and that was 1998 to 2012 when Neptune was in Aquarius. It was the internet. you know uh it's the time of the global community. Everybody was able to access technology now. All right, we were getting our phones, and we were amazed because we no longer had to pull out the map. It was very much technology that brought us together as a grand community. um and then we got into the period of 2012 to now, which is social media. um Social media is a very Neptunian concept as far as a reflection of the collective unconscious. How people behave on the internet is very different than how they behave when they go to their local food store. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, or in your local community, it's like you can
Yeah,
just let it all out.
that's always amazing to me is how vitriolic the internet is, and and then you go out in the world and everybody's generally okay. At least where I am, I'm only talking about my lived experience. Everybody has a different one. But in modern astrology, Neptune is in its domicile in Pisces. It loves being in Pisces. But this is a great example, in my opinion, of where just because something is in domicile, it doesn't mean it's a good thing. It just means it works best there.
Yes,
And
I would agree.
yeah, I mean, social media has every voice is heard, everybody's loud. It doesn't have to have anything to do with reality. It's ungrounded. And it's also we've also been talking a lot about quantum. The word quantum has become very, very popular in the vernacular now, as far it's something within itself. It's another level deeper. And we social media really has captured that Pisces movement of everything all at once. Really is what it comes down to. You go on the internet and you're just inundated, all right, with good things, with bad things, with your friends, with your enemies, with ideas you agree with, ideas that you don't agree with, but it's always there. It's just churning and churning and churning. And we saw the beginning of AI and how that is reflected in there. I mean, look at AI art. How Neptunian is AI art? It's like, again, an amalgam of all of these different things, and then there's just like a random hand over here, or it's got this kind of otherworldly quality, and in its infancy, that is very Piscean and very Neptunian, and we're still right in that phase with it. um so, and as I said, the 0 degrees Aries is the Aries point, and we're hitting that um this year, and we will be there until essentially 2040. I think it's 2039 is when we move out of it. um Aries is a reset at the purest level. It's the response to Pisces, which is everything all at once, whereas Aries is like very crystal clear. It's this way. you know we tend to view Aries as very aggressive, but it's also very defensive. It's the archetype of the warrior, and the warrior holds both the sword and the shield. Um, there there are a lot of qualities where you want to strike out as your own entity. From a nature standpoint, I view Aries, and especially the spring equinox, as the first kind of flower that pops up out of the ground. There is a magical quality of reinitiation when we get to that Aries 0 point in the year, and that is going to be reflective of how all of these planets work. I view these planets as monuments to the spirit, and the monument of spirit of Neptune going into Aries is very much about that active, offensive, and defensive kind of capabilities in response to the craziness of the Pisces. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see social media start to break up. It's no longer, we're seeing blue sky come into the picture. We're seeing circle become popular. People are paring down and trying to get away from that. It's too much. Let's see if I can break this down into something more controllable, into something more that I can be active in, rather than just a screaming voice in the clouds of social media. Um, Liz Green, really, she has a giant book on Neptune. I don't know if you've seen it. If you don't want to read it,
Yes.
you can use it to stop a heavy door. It's a big thick it's a big thick book, and she talks about the concept of corruption very much with anytime you're dealing with Neptune and Mars, and as Mars is the ruler of Aries. And I think that's true. And when we look back in history, we see that as well. But it's really a response to corruption. Both we see the active end of the corruption and the response of the people to corruption. And the stage is set. I mean, without getting into too many details that sound political, I mean, I don't think that anybody thinks that the other side of their beliefs is non-corrupt. Would you agree?
Oh, I would.
Yeah.
And that 0 point Aries is a very creative point, and it's also called the world point in astrology. So anything at 0 cardinal, which is Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, and those points are going to be touched on quite a bit this year and next year.
Yeah. And in mundane astrology, the 0 Aries point is essentially the most important point for anything.
Mm.
It is the initiation of that cycle. Um, but we're moving away from into that more personalized view, I think. Um, we're seeing resistance art. There's this artist now popping up by the name of Jesse Wells, and he sings these minute and a half long resistance songs that are very folksy. But they're very clear to the point of fighting the corruption. That is very, resistance art is very much Neptune and Aries to me. Um, you know, the fog of war is very much Neptunian. I don't necessarily, there's some people who think that every time Neptune goes into Aries, that means there's a war. I don't think that's necessarily true, because there's a lot of different versions of war. We literally just entered into a trade war in the US here yesterday. So, and that's not too far away. And you'll often see that pattern with the ingresses of Neptune into Aries, as there's this about 3 or 4 month buildup period, where we're starting to see how that's actually going to manifest. We're also getting into a point where we're soon going to be able to design our own reality. and that is coming with AI. You know, we're at very early stages of it right now, but can you imagine what's going to happen? Think of the technology in the past 15 years and what we've been able to achieve since, since then, and what are the next 15 years going to look like? I mean, I think we're gonna be seeing virtual reality. I think we're gonna be seeing, um, you can already create your own music on AI. That's only going to get better. You can just prompt your way into your own style of art. All of that is very Neptune and Aries to me, where it's like you are the initiator and you are the receiver of your own personal experience and how you want the world to frame. That has a lot of consequences. That's it sounds exciting, and I'm sure it's going to be exciting. But look at what has happened to the artists during this period of time when we've moved to, um, you know, the end of this Piscean period of Neptune. I find a lot of creative people have had a lot of things lifted from them to get to this point. And we're going to be using all of this collective art, all of these collective ideas, and we're going to be breaking them down like Pisces does, and then taking the Aries zero step of reinitiating it into our own way of doing things. And I think that's really going to be the story with that. So can we move to the so yeah, this is really, I mean, this is from the upcoming Deep Earth Tarot deck. These two, and these are the cards that represent the Aries and the Neptunian qualities. In tarot, the Emperor represents Aries. It's a regal figure. It's often in control, and you can it's very much like the father-like figure in some ways, but it's also the grandfather figure. It's the ruler. Um, and this is where and then we have the Hanged Man here. Again, I take a less dark view of the Hanged Man card, and I view it as our way to kind of see things from an enchanted view. But if we look at the archetypal values of both of these pictures, we can kind of see where corruption can come from. If we turn that throne upside down and dip him into the water, is the ruler thinking with with the people in mind? You see the emperor holding the seed of initiation there. That seed's not going to bloom if it's purely underwater. There's a lot of interesting archetypal thoughts that we can have when we're looking at Aries and Neptune. Aries can also represent the daredevil. It's a risk taker. It's the adventurer. It's going into bold new places. Um, it's the warrior. Obviously, we've talked about that with the sword and the shield. But it is also this royal figure. It wants to make clear-cut decisions. It wants to be uncomplicated, and unfortunately, Neptune is very good at complicating things, creating that delusion, creating that confusion. And when these two merge, we can see where things are really going to go.
Yeah, that mix of fire and water is an interesting combination.
Absolutely. I mean, passion meets emotion. I think we're there. I think we're entering a nexus point with that. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this is the chart of the actual ingress into Aries. And this is important for a couple of reasons. First off, let's look at the chart. Now, this is the US chart. We're going to be talking mainly about the US here because of the way that the ascendants work in other parts in the world. It's going to have a different ascendant. Um, but look at the train of Pisces and Aries that we have here. Very interesting. So we're talking a lot of things happening in the 12th house, which is the collective unconscious. It's hidden enemies. One thing that's happening right now is we just had the essentially the Chinese state answer to our AI program. And I watched the press conference that OpenAI had. OpenAI are essentially the leaders, the forefronters of the American AI movement. And when asked about this, this new Chinese AI, he said the message was essentially, "How dare the Chinese steal from us what we stole from you?" Yeah, and I thought that that was so interesting to look at this ingress chart, because I view right behind Neptune is that conjunction of retrograde Mercury and Venus. Um, when Mercury and Venus come together, I call that the artist conjunction. um it's all about that. It's where skill meets art. It's where skill meets vibe. It's where we're able to communicate our truest sense of spirit and value to the world. And that being in retrograde during a time when we're going through all of this it's very interesting. But look at the planets that are ahead of Neptune, and during this ingress. And an ingress, for anybody that's not an astrologer, just means when something enters into a new sign. And we're talking right now about the Neptune entering into Aries. You can see it circled there with the 0 degrees. So we have the sun and the moon and Chiron just ahead of Neptune. When the sun and the moon are kind of sharing a space, it becomes, I feel, very important to identity. It's our external, it's how we approach the world, and the ego and the path that we're on, and also the internal world. We are wanting to strike free right now from all of that Piscean heaviness and the confusion, the milieu. And also note, I mean, we've got the North Node there. Like, that is going to exponentially increase the kind of feeling that this is our destiny. This is where we need to be going. And Aries and Neptune is sitting there at the precipice between these 2 points, trying to sort some of this out. And it's going to be a very interesting time. What are your thoughts on this chart?
Well, it's super interesting because, like I mentioned before about the water to fire. So it's, just thinking of the elements. The fire could make the water boil and create steam. The water can put out the fire, so many different ways. But it's like in the chart is all the planets are in one half of the chart, that what we have here, except for the south node, but you can still call it half the chart. So there's this
Hmm.
super concentration basically in two signs of that Pisces of everybody and everything, like you've mentioned before. But then now let's experiment, be adventurous, and pioneering and try some new things. So I would say, in science and medical, there'll be some breakthroughs perhaps, and
Yeah.
people trying things maybe that they've never tried before, so that's exciting.
Yeah.
There's we're at that initiation, we might have 1,000 experiments or 1,000 things, but only 5 or 10 stick. But it's
Hmm.
still trying all those new things, and it's like you said, it's in that 12th house here, and we use the chart for Washington D.C. So I would say people are waking up.
Yes, for sure. And I think you nailed the right word in your description. I think that in this mix of water and fire, the Neptune is the steam. It's kind of the byproduct of this transition of going from this time when we're all in this haze of influence and overstimulation emotionally, um, to a time when we really want to pare it down. And that process is an alchemical process, and one of the byproducts of that is going to be this Neptunian steam, and it's going to start permeating everything, and you're going to feel the heat. you know it's just where we're at. um
Well, and taking a steam or a hot bath could be a really good way to use that energy to work through it, and maybe,
yes.
just to work with that energy. And I wanted to mention that this is about 24 hours after a new moon, this
Well,
chart.
yeah. Yes. So it's, we're definitely in that new moon time. Moon in Aries, very, very determined. It's definitely an initiator. It's not scared to jump into the mix. Another interesting thing that I discovered when I was going through these ingresses into Aries is that there is, often with the way that these waveforms that we talked about in the beginning of the pod um, work is they kind of create these mountains of influence. They ascend and then they descend. In this situation, we're also doing this with Uranus. So this shadow period that extends or from essentially March of 2025 into the beginning of 2026, where we're kind of bouncing in and out of from Pisces to Aries, is going to have a relationship with Uranus and Gemini, and that Uranus and Gemini is all about being rebellious in your communication. It's also about technology that is going to be kind of opening things up into a world of knowledge, and into all of those air qualities, interconnectedness. So a lot of times people point back to the ingress. If you can go to the next chart, a lot of people point back to this ingress when they talk about Neptune going into Aries as war, and that war is inevitable. Now, war, again, as I said before, war has a lot of different versions of it. But one thing I realized is that when Neptune is bouncing back and forth in that shadow period between retrograde and direct, and it shares it with another planet, it is not a bloody war. This one in particular was one of the few times I could find when Neptune was really on its own during its shadow and during its direct period. Um, the other thing to understand about this one, because this exact date was essentially it was the Battle of Fort Sumter that kicked off the Civil War. Some things to understand about that, though. This was a very confusing Neptunian time. When we look back at the Civil War, it was not, while there were, things that were brewing under the surface for years. I mean, the South seceded in January. Lincoln was inaugurated in March. And then in April, the Battle of Fort Sumter happened on the day of the ingress of Neptune into Aries. And the Union lost that battle. This is a very confusing time. Talk about, we talked about that phrase fog of war. That was very much a fog of war. What's happening as well? Mercury is right there. All right, Mercury in Pisces. That is not a clear communicator. That's about the opposite of a clear communicator. We also have this mix of the Moon, Mars, and Uranus happening up there in the ninth house. Um, very, very indicative of a battle, especially Gemini, two sides to the battle. Um, so I did want to address that Neptune moving into Aries doesn't necessarily mean war. There's always corruption afoot. I'm sure that the people in the North thought that the people in the South were corrupt, and I'm sure that the people in the South thought that the people in the North were corrupt. That is the theme that we see. It's that push and that pull. It is not necessarily meaning that we're going to be going into some kind of physical war right away. Is it always a possibility? Of course. It's a crazy time, but it does not mean that. Um, and when we talk about this chart in particular, I mean, a lot of this war had to do with slavery. And I want to talk about the interconnectedness of how these ingresses work over long periods of time. So we can go to the next chart. So this chart, this was back in 1697. So we said that there's about 160 some years between the full rotation. Here we see something similar to what we are seeing in this ingress. This was actually the end of a war. This year was the end of the 9 Years' War in Europe. And the date was actually the first meeting of the Peace of Ryswick. And the Peace of Ryswick was a series of treaties that essentially set up most of the modern, pre-20th century World War stuff, obviously, but most of the modern boundaries for a lot of the European nations. It was basically France versus everybody else. So this is an idea of, this, it doesn't necessarily mean the initiation of war. It might have a very warlike time. But another interesting piece of this puzzle here with this chart is that this was very much a naval war. And at the time, Britain was the naval power. During the 9 Years' War is when we saw all of these, these European nations beef up their naval power. France, by the end of the 9 Years' War, was more of a naval power than Britain. So they had all of these ships and all of these sailors at the end of this war after these treaties signed, and then they had nothing to do. You know, so and we're at the end of a 9 Years' War. What did they do? Well, this was the time when they used those ships to greatly expand the human slave trade. Um, you know, corruption. They use the fog of war to create corruption. What is When we look at the Uranus? What is the Uranus in? It's in Cancer. It's all about the homeland, the home, where our identity of that home life is. We're talking about country boundaries. We're talking about people being forcibly removed from their homes. So by putting these shadow periods together and understanding how these waveforms work, we can see a more complete picture than just using one ingress as an indicator of how things are happening. And I do think that these outer planets work together. So let's go, if we're going to go forward from here, so we see that at this point, this is when we saw the slave trade greatly advance. It was at the end of a war. Well, what was the Civil War? What was a big impetus of that? Slavery, racial division. And what are we seeing now? We're seeing corruption that is being fueled by that same racial division. All three of these ingresses have a common theme of the corrupt authoritarian using delusion and falsity, which I do feel like the isms are very Neptunian, sexism, racism. These are not actual things. These are constructs that we build in our own head to make our, to hurt someone. Um, all of these ingresses connect to that theme of power, corruption, and creating these false divisions in in this case. And I'm sure it will change over time as we move through more of these ingresses. It's hard to go back from 1697. There's not a lot of documentation from the Middle Ages or before that, but I would not be surprised to see that be a continuing trend in these Aries Neptune ingresses. Is this, there's this deep corruption from the powers that be, and it's fueled by these false delusional Neptunian narratives. Does that make sense?
Oh, it sure does. And I wanted to add that you'd said that we have a trade war started, but we
Mhm.
also have a war on drugs.
Yeah.
The people that are pushing fentanyl and other drugs in our country, and I'm sure that's happening other places too. So,
Yeah,
and
that is what he said was the reason why we entered the trade war, because of fentanyl and because of immigration. I mean, isms. And the truth is, and I looked up the statistics myself, less than 1% of the fentanyl comes from Canada. Less than 1% of the illegal immigration comes from Canada. What really is if we want to look at the border, from the U.S. Canada standpoint, the bigger issue is that there is tons of illegal arms that enter Canada from the U.S. So again, it's just this fog of war full of these delusions and contraptions that we've built that they're not backed by anything corporeal. They're these thoughts, and we see that, and it's all just going to be coming to a head as far as how I think that we respond to that. While I don't think that there's going to be bloody war, I do think there's going to be resistance. I do think that there's going to be, we've already seen, severe acts of resistance that have been pushed into our milieu through social media, one way or the other, for good or for bad. As I said, we're starting to see like resistance art popping up. So Neptune controls all of these things. It's not just one thing that Neptune dictates, but this one thing that seems to be consistent is this Liz Green concept of corruption that triggers all of these isms in our head that do not have any corporeal reality, and that we are on an attack and defend point of view with it. And I think that's really the impetus of how this works. Now, I mean, it's certainly something that needs more exploration. Um, but I really do feel like that's the way of it. I do not think I do not think Neptune is horrible, and I do not think that Neptune is going to cause us to be in a civil war. I just think that we see these themes time and time again. And the most important thing is that there is an integral relationship between, especially the three outer planets, probably more. Uh, I'm not an expert on asteroids. I'm sure they're in play here. I'm sure Chiron's in play. But can we go to that slide about this one right here? So this is really interesting, because when I'm looking at, we have three big we have more than three, really. I mean, this is a year of the ingress. We're already have Pluto in Aquarius, which just happened recently. Uranus is moving into Gemini. Uh, and Neptune is moving into Aries. I mean, if that doesn't scream AI to you, I don't know what possibly can. I mean, Pluto moving into Aquarius is all about, a kind of a reset and a rebirth of community and technology. Uranus moving into, obviously Pluto moving into Aquarius is going to be affected by the ruler of Aquarius, which is Uranus moving into Gemini. It's all about how we communicate. Um, it's all about how we learn. It's definitely the written word, and that has now changed. I mean, ask my partner; she's a writing professor, you know. And then we're getting. I also do feel that Neptune in Aries could, in this situation, represent a new form of consciousness, a new form of that higher consciousness. And it's not going to be human, but it's really trying to be. And that's the interesting part about these graphs right here. The arc AGI score progression, what you're looking at is essentially how close AI can be to a functional human being. So when chat gp2 gp3 came out, gp4, look at how low they were. Great, they were awesome, but they were not even close to being on the level of a human being as far as its discernment. Um, but look what happened around March of 2024. That is almost a right angle. The increase in ability that we happened when Pluto was doing its final kind of push from Capricorn into Aquarius, that period of time, we went from roughly 8% to in the 80s as far as how close we are to achieving a human level of consciousness within these AI systems. This is all from OpenAI, by the way. This is OpenAI's O3. O3 just came out yesterday, as far as their models. And if the other chart that's up on the upper right is, this is where it's been over time. So if we look, we are on track to hit sentience, human sentience, whatever that means. I'm not saying it's actually human, but a comparable sentience by the end of this year. I could absolutely see that being a very, a Neptunian Aries and thing, is this whole new thing has consciousness. And what is this going to open up for us? And this is really that whole mix of those planets expressing themselves in a way that is going to kind of change humanity in the way these outer planets do. We have that Pluto changing everything about our technology and the way we view community. We have that Uranus being that spike change to how we learn, and then spirituality changing, what we view as spirit, what we view as alive. I talked very much about my nature spirituality, reflecting that, Aries is all that first spark out of the ground with the flower. that could very much with Neptune apply to a new level of consciousness. We're going to have those conversations. What if this thing is telling us it's alive? How do we deal with that? Will we say it's alive? I mean, these are all things that are very outer planety to me. What are your? Did I go off the deep end? Are we going to have to edit this down?
No, no, no. I think it's perfect. Yeah, and maybe what we thought was real isn't real. We're going to have a new reality even of what
Yeah.
is real.
And we're going to be able to construct it. We're going to have a lot more input in the construction of that this time around than we did at the end of the 1800s or the 1600s because of the technology. And and it for as much as things change, though, we're still going to be dealing with the oligarchy controlling it, that corruption, all right, that division. How much more can you get away with in terms of the division when everybody's in their own box? I mean, it's complicated, and it's multivalent, and it's going to affect many different things in many different ways. So yeah, I mean, that's really just kind of my take on it, and how Neptune is going to go into Aries, and how we're really going to see things develop. It's going to be a fascinating time because all of these outer planets are not really going to take their final shape until 2026. 2025 is, you've pointed this out, is going to be that time when we're kind of bouncing between these retrogrades and these shadow periods, and we're going to really, I think these periods kind of crystallize what the themes of the next sign is going to be. Um, but we're not really going to see the effects, I think, until the beginning of 2026. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I would agree. And you did a great talk, and thanks for doing all the research. Yeah,
Yeah,
because as things change, I don't think that they're going to stick because they're going to change three, four, five, maybe even 10 times
yeah.
over the next few years. And
Hmm.
as we learn to do more things and expand our consciousness, and um, I'm sure medical technology will change
Hmm.
on a huge level. I mean, I know they're doing robotic surgery and they have for a
Yeah.
while, but I think that they're going to even get better and better and better at all that stuff.
And that
So,
that ties into the AI stuff too, because one of the things the AI is doing is it's coming up with pharmaceuticals that we never have been able to do. I mean, I watch a few health influencers, and one of the things they're saying is like, hold on until like 2035. Keep yourself healthy until like 2035. And then all these biomedical things are going to greatly increase our lives. One of the things they're talking about with health in particular is not so much that we're going to come out with a new um, series of drugs, but that we're going to be able to make the drugs that we have little side effects. It'll be less of an encumberment upon us. And yeah, AI is going to do a lot of great things. I mean, it's also, talking about this multivalent nature of how these planets operate, it's also going to put a lot of people out of work. And these are things we're going to have to deal with. So yeah, I'm so happy you had me. I'm so happy you let me go off on my tangent for Neptune and Aries, my favorite planet.
well, and I would think that they might come up with some innovative cures or ways to deal with viruses and stuff because
Oh yeah.
I assume that Neptune rules viruses.
Yeah.
Um, so that'll be exciting.
Things that are insidious.
Hmm.
And I think disease and drugs and things that kind of creep in and cause problems are often very Neptunian. And it's hard to say. We're astrologers. We're doing our best. We can look at these themes from an archetypal standpoint. I'm personally not a horary astrologer where I could say this is going to happen on this time and this date. I look at more of the overall world astrology, the waveforms, how these planets are interacting, and what we can see as themes from the past from a more up top view. So I hope we can do this again.
We will, and we'll probably come back and visit this topic again next year. But in
Yes.
the meantime, Robert's going to be coming on my show periodically and talking
Hmm.
about magical astrology.
Yes.
And Robert and I both do consultations, and
Hmm.
you can email us to make an appointment. And we both have newsletters, and I have a YouTube channel. Um, and then I'll let Robert tell you what he's been doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a busy year, regardless of all these ingresses. I'm also part of the Talk Cosmos team. I'm on the U.S. Global Currents Astrological Perspective team with Sue Minahan and Justin Crockett-Elzy. I'm also on the Turning Seasons with Linda Berry. That's a vibrational astrology podcast. I'm the director of the Magus Gathering, um, which is a nature spirituality gathering that is hosted in Gore, Virginia, every year. It's a fantastic event. Our theme this year is Music of the Spheres. It's a lot of magical astrology. We're excited about it. You can go to magisgathering.com to find out more about that. And we're also starting a vibrational astrology conference this year. It's called Fractal Cosmos. It's going to be online for this year, and our goal is to make this a live person event. Once we get our footings, we have some great presenters, and we're looking forward to it. And we hope you can participate.
Wow, you're a busy person and active in
Yeah.
a lot of things. So, other I have the Astrology Star Sisters, and we cover the dwarf planets, planet stationing, decans using astrology and tarot, fixed stars, Uranian astrology, and Chinese astrology. And I've been doing the 2025 astrological highlights, which this show is part of. And Robert will be back on magical astrology, and then Justin Crockett-Elzy and myself do the astrology forecast each month, the full moon forecast, and the Chiron asteroid series. And I will be on Talk Cosmos on February 23rd, part of the Archetypal Symbols team, talking about the Pisces new moon at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And you can watch that here on my channel. And again, to get a hold of Robert, his website is deepearthastrology.com, and my website is alightpath.com. And I want to take this moment to thank all of you that have joined us live and all that come back and join and watch at a later time. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye for now.